It was also a time when all over Kerala, temple protection committees, Kshetra Samrakshana Samidhigala, temple restoration samadhis, Kshetra Punaruddharana Samidhigala, different forms of saptahams, navahams, etc., the reading of Bhagavata, reading of Mahabharata, reading of Ramayana, etc., being conducted in private domestic spaces, in public spaces, where it became, so to speak, a major cultural activity for the upper caste Hindu or Hindu homes in general, in Hindu population, where effectively this cultural discourse, which was run in terms of bhakti or devotion, which was done in terms of your acquaintance with a set of texts, which was considered to be cultural primarily and less religious in nature, or even if it is a religious kind of discourse, it was a form or different forms or attempts at the consolidation of a Hindu community structured on the basis of a revival of age-old values. The formation or the construction of a political Hindu community based on the ideas of Hindutva was actually, it's a consolidated project. And even the protocols of the RSS and the Hindu Vedi clearly indicate that this was not just something that happened accidentally. It was not something accidental. It was an extremely well planned, extremely well executed kind of project where along with the overtaking of temple grounds for RSS activity, there were these different kinds of cultural actions, cultural discourses, which were clearly directed at the public, clearly directed at a Hindu society in creating or constituting what can only be called today in retrospect as a Hindu political community, the formation of a Hindu political community. I know I'm going a bit fast, but because there is a lot of historical material to be traversed, I'm sorry about that. If there are questions which come up later, I shall, of course, try to explain and detail further. As this was going on, a major incident which took place was the Nilakal issue in March 1983. There was a concerted strike by several Hindu groups or Hindutva groups to prevent a church being built at a location where it was claimed that a cross planted by St. Thomas was discovered. Apart from the question of whether this particular cross was a real cross actually planted by St. Thomas or not, or whether it was actually a fictitious one, a kind of fake thing that was actually planted, there is another issue. But what we have to realize is that this helped in bringing together, in rallying huge numbers of the Hindu community all over Kerala, the length and breadth of Kerala, from Kasaragod to, shall we say, to Trivandrum, to Kanyakumari, so to speak. Huge rallies were held, huge meetings were held, and the whole idea of Hindu community being in a position of being victimized, that they were under attack, their beliefs were under attack, their positions were under attack, their relics were under attack, was actually bandied about. Along with this, you had this, clash in the Chala market of Trivandrum, as well as the controversy connected with the story, the play of Bhagavan Kalumaranu, which was, again, at one point of time, it appeared to be banned or prohibited from actually being played. So what you find immediately after the emergency, the lifting of the emergency, was a continuation of a certain system where the cultural province or the cultural domain effectively became the domain within which political discourse of a very, very Hindutva manner, of a revivalist kind, was actually making its presence felt all over Kerala. And it is in this context that I would like to place the publication in 1983 of Kala Vimarshan, Marxist Manadandam, a collected volume of essays, which was edited by Chindra Ravindran, and actually the major, shall we say, spirit behind it, the soul behind it, being Dr. T.K. Ramachandran. Now, this Kala Vimarshan, because I happen to be not associated with it, no, I was much younger for that time, but almost on the fringes, listening to the discourses which were going on. There were Balachandran Chullikad, T.K. Ramachandran, Ravindran, M. Muralidharan of the brilliant intellect, who was an MG University historian. A number of people were there, and looking at it from the sidelines, from the fringes, so to speak, What I understood it to be was as a concerted attempt to bring about a kind of alliance among different left-wing factions, which went beyond organizational divides, organizational divisions, so as to confront this burgeoning threat to democracy, which was the formation of a particular kind of Hindu politics, a particular kind of revivalist, fundamentalist Hindu politics, which, according to T.K. Ramachandran, was really the greatest danger that the Indian nation was facing at that point of time. If I may quote from the preface to that book, which is written by Ravindran, I quote here, quotes, political oppression has several forms and practical levels. They do not work merely through police lathis, bullets, or the daggers of religious fanaticism. Quite often, they also enter the body of society in such forms as newspapers, works of art, religious lectures, styles of language, and so on. Even when the forms are different, their directions are none too different when it comes to their objective of protecting the power of the hegemonic classes. They have the nature of a combined counter-aggression that continually sharpens itself through the mutual reinforcement of its constituents. Ours is a time when the second form of oppression, that is cultural oppression, is getting more and more extensive. Another aspect that is also mentioned here is the power of newspapers, of media, that constantly engage in misinformation and ideological manipulation, the rise of several popular art forms with culture taking on the contours of an industry, the rise of a revivalist culture that seeks to reassert an upper caste culture of devotion and religious ritual, the changing styles of language wherein upper caste fascist politics and the discourses of ethical instruction use the same categories or concepts or even terminology. That there is a withdrawal, if I may quote T.K. Ramachandran, a regression from a strongly left-wing culture that had come to define Keralam in the preceding decades was the most significant change of the moment. Looking at it in retrospect, what I see here is effectively a cultural turn, a kind of cultural turn that is immensely different from the cultural turn that we usually associate with the happenings in the post-1967 period within Europe. The impact of the post-1960, the 1967 student revolts, etc. But this is a very different kind of cultural turn. Yes, what we find as an abiding principle that is latent within this particular cultural turn is a realization that culture is not secondary, is not reflective, is not something that continues from what is effectively an economic base structure, but that it is a constitutive domain, a domain where the economic and the political actually unfold in ideological forms, in discursive forms, so to speak. And what you find in that work is an approach born of local site-specific context. I can't repeat this more. An approach born of local site-specific context and is a product of a history that was in the process of unfolding. This particular book project, this idea of creating a book, did not come from a theoretical inspiration from outside, did not come from a theoretical input from outside. Of course, it may have used theory. For example, there's a lot of use of Frankfurt School, of Gramscian theory, of Althusserian theory, especially the state apparatuses, etc. The use of Raymond Williams, Roland Barthes, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of even structuralist theory being used within that. And of course, Marx to the core. But it was not a case, and I would like to repeat this, it was not a case of theory first, but the experience of reality. The imaginary that is actually created by that experience of reality that occasioned and determined this particular critical venture. And if you look at the venture itself, the volume itself, it appears to have a clear internal progression. There are articles by Sachidanandan, B. Rajivan, Ravindran, R. Nandakumar, N.S. Madhavan, Balachandran Chullikat, Muralidharan, T.K. Ramachandran, and appendices which are the first part primarily theoretical and the second part of appendices comprising of actual case studies of everyday culture, of popular culture, of cinema, as well as of pictorial arts of sculpture and painting. But when you look at the book, what you find there is a clear internal movement from literature to art and cinema, and then from there to popular culture and everyday life. Let me repeat this. A movement from literature to art and cinema, and then on to popular culture and everyday life. brought together in terms of questions of ideology. And a running strand is a deep concern with agendas of revivalism and Hindu fundamentalism. And it is here that we find the first occasion of a particular term being used. And no, it is not cultural studies. No, it is not samskara padhanam. But what is present there is an idea of critique, samskarika vimarsham, of cultural critique, not cultural studies, which is considered the most important aspect, not as an academic exercise, but a political venture, and a political publication venture which actually seeks to impinge upon, seeks to actually critique the existing experiential domain in such a fashion as to affect it, transform it, change it, so to speak. And it is here where this idea of critique comes in, that there is an awareness that culture is a political domain, and that many of the political dramas of daily life are carried out in the spheres of language and everyday culture. If I may quote T.K. Ramachandran here in his, in his notes, where he writes, particularly in Kerala today, a major form of false consciousness is culture, as noun and as adjective. From ideological controversies to private conversations, culture appears as a cliche. And this particular critique of culture, what you find a major quality of that, which we probably see in terms of cultural studies elsewhere, but here in terms of an actual experiential paradigm, this critique is an immanent critique. And that is very important, I guess, because culture is not seen as an object, as something that is external of the subject who engages in critique. It is a process, a phenomenon in which the critic is deeply embedded, implicated, involved. It is not something outside of himself or herself. It is not something external to him, and where there is a knowledge relationship in terms of a subject and an object. No, there is no critical distance. On the other hand, it is a historical experience of the subject that seems to actually propel the critique. The subject is at the center of the critique itself. The subject is actually engaged in the critique, quite aware of its own subjectivity in terms of that particular critique. And as I mentioned before, another running strand is a deep anxiety and concern with the rise of Hindu fundamentalism, with its structures of refeudalization and revivalism. And there is a quote here which actually says, down to a T, which identifies the problem very clearly, which I have not translated into English because it will lose all that strength if it is ever translated. And it says, I'm quoting Ramachandran here, വിപ്ലവം പൂർത്തിയാവുകയാണെന്നും പഴയ വ്യവസ്ഥിതിയുടെ നിർദ്ദയാചാരങ്ങളും ഭീമശാസനങ്ങളും ഇന്നിനി വരാത്തവണ്ണം ചരിത്രത്തിന്റെ ചവറ്റുകൊട്ടയിൽ അപ്രത്യക്ഷമായി കഴിഞ്ഞുവെന്നും സ്വപ്നം കണ്ട ഒരു തലമുറ പെട്ടെന്ന് ചോരയും ജീവനും ത്യജിച്ച് കുടങ്ങളിലടിച്ച് കടലിൽ എറിഞ്ഞ ദുർഭൂതങ്ങൾ ഓരോന്നായി പകൽ വെട്ടത്തിൽ ഉയർന്നു വരുന്നത് കണ്ടുണരുമ്പോൾ അവരുടെ കണ്ണുകളെ തന്നെ വിശ്വസിക്കാൻ മടിക്കുന്നതിൽ അത്ഭുതത്തിന് അവകാശമില്ല. The specters, he's speaking of spectre. There is an echo here. Durbhudangal, the specters, the ghosts that they thought they had actually put into the earthen pots and thrown into the sea. Yes, there is a very strong, what you call echo of the Hindu ritualistic funeral here, or the oblation, funeral oblations. But what is interesting there is that the entire Hindu language, or the Hindu religious language, is actually taken by TK in order to indicate that all those things, rituals, beliefs, superstitions, etc., which were considered passé, which we were considered were beyond as a result of the rise of secularism and the scientific spirit, are all coming back with a vengeance. And it is these specters that are actually haunting us, almost in an echo of Marx, or even an echo probably of Derrida in that sense. The specter of these bygone ages, these bygone beliefs are actually hanging over Kerala in that sense. Now, this is a realization. This is a tragic vision, a catastrophic vision, one should say, of what is in store for us, what is in store for Kerala, which basically prompted this entire venture. Now, what this resulted in actual terms within the book, was an attempt to critique popular culture, without accepting any of the divides between the high culture and low culture. As at one point in the book, it says, it is not the concern of this book to actually come up with different kinds of methodologies for the critique of Aravindan, who belongs to high cinema, and of I.V. Shashi, who belongs to popular cinema, but looking at the ideological links between Aravindan and I.V. Shashi, and look at how they, in different ways, create an ideological atmosphere that is actually supportive or actually legitimizing of the powers that be. And probably equally important about this is the language of that discourse. Just as in one sense, they said that language was a domain, an area in which this kind of cultural discourse, these wares, ideological wares were being propagated. The writers of the book, the editors of the book, the thinkers of the book were deeply aware of the discourse in which they had to speak. The book is in Malayalam, and that needs repetition. The book is in Malayalam. And it's a book, the book is in Malayalam, especially in the context to be realized, especially in the context that not a single person, not a single author in that book, it was incapable of writing in English. Some of them were brilliant writers of English, like Muralidharan or T.K. Ramachandran, were all brilliant writers, stylistically brilliant writers in English, but they chose to write it in Malayalam is probably the most important thing here. The need and desire to intervene in the circulation of meanings and the cultural life of Kerala, to address the lived reality of Kerala, not just as an academic exercise, but in terms of a significantly political critique. This is what you find in that entire venture. In fact, it is after that, by 1987, that you have the rise of a number of other national phenomenon like the Ramayana TV serial, a number of others. And if you think of what is happening right now in the present year, we realize the clairvoyance, the political clairvoyance, I mean, if that is a wrong word, the ability to actually look into the future that book offered us, because it was looking at the catastrophe that is awaiting us, and that catastrophe is what we are living in right now. The Durbhudas, the kind of ghosts that came back, are right now in the echelons of power, in the seats of power, and they have come to rule, specters that have come to rule us. Going back to that time, what in effect this opened was a space for a political critique of culture. However, critique of culture and a space and a language for critique, a kind of what one would call an approach, a language. I wouldn't want to call it a methodology, but a number of ideological or theoretical modalities, a number of theoretical approaches with which that critique could be conducted. At the same time, there is one misgiving, there are a couple of misgivings, a couple of critiques that can also be said in retrospect, looking at that venture in retrospect. It is sad to say that this volume, even as it completely redefined the critical thinking culture of Keralam, it was also probably the least acknowledged. People seem to compete with one another to erase its memory, even deny its existence. I mean, which is very interesting. It was almost as if Kalavimarsham, you always had to keep it there, but you use it, but you never acknowledge it. As M. Muralidharan once actually said, when he was listening to someone speaking at a seminar, he just pointed to him and said, "This is my ghost." When people who go around like ghosts are apparent in Kerala society where they never acknowledge this. Why hasn't Kalavimarsham been properly acknowledged is a serious question. It has something to do with our own ethical responsibilities, with our own cultural responsibilities. But at another level, there are limitations in the work. And in historical retrospective, the two major limitations that you find in the book is that questions of gender and caste, especially Dalit issues, are not directly addressed in the work. It is interesting to note that Kalavimarsham addressed the question of gender only tangentially, as a question of representation in films, especially in the work of Ravindran. And on the other hand, the need for a critique of caste and of structures of caste exclusion in culture and language is broached, but not addressed in detail. For instance, there is this little observation by T.K. Ramachandran where he says that the smell of sambar is considered vasana, good smell, but the smell of fish is considered matam in language, bad smell. And the deeply casteist ideology that is present in what appears to be a very innocuous use of language. Sambar being connected with upper caste, higher caste Hindus, and fish being connected with lower caste or non-Hindus, etc. So how even everyday usage of language is so casteist, is so imbued with the values of caste. He made an observation in that. But ultimately speaking, despite these observations, it still remains that a serious addressing, a serious consideration of the issues of women and the issues of caste, especially Dalit issues, was absent in that work. There is one possible defense, that dedicated as it was primarily to a secular critique of Hindu fundamentalism and revivalism, its primary concern was with the formation of a broad secular or left alliance. But the work is limited, we will have to say, in that sense. Now, the work of Nila publishers and Kalavi Macham and the secular attempts connected with that continued in a number of other organizations and in the writings of the period, especially under the auspices of secular collective. But it is here that we find another little turn, another important turn, so to speak, within what one would call the cultural turn within Kerala culture itself. The critical space that was formed by this particular venture, the critical space which actually acquired a certain kind of critical language, a critical methodology, so to speak, that was furthered, expanded, and made even more politically astute by the rise of feminist movements in the state. Several feminist groups were formed in Kerala during the period 1982 to 94, such as Prajodhana in Trivandrum, Manushi in Patambi, Bodhana in Calicut, Chetana in Thrissur, Gramina Vanida Sangham in Tiruvalla, Prabuddhada in Kanyangad, Sahaja in Kottayam, and Stri Patana Kendram in Kottayam. It is interesting to note that even as there was a presence of feminist ideas and movements on a national level, the rise of these local movements were less the continuations of the national ones and more in the form of responses to very specific political issues of public and domestic violence in Kerala. Actually, two particular incidents or two particular phenomena are of extreme importance in this process of the rise of feminist thought and feminist activity within Kerala. The first is, of course, the infamous incident of Thankamani, the Thankamani Sambhavam, Thankamani incident in October 1986, in which a group of policemen were accused of violating and raping the women of Thankamani village in Idukki district, which was the consideration, a continuation of a controversy or a clash between bus owners and the people of the land, people of that particular Thankamani village. But it created, it was a time when the right UDF government was in power, and it created ripples across the state. And this was almost like a switch-on reaction with several feminist groups, several women actually making a beeline to the place. And there was a politicization. That is the most important thing. There was a radical politicization, a radical political awareness that came out of that particular, and a discursive going forward, especially in the context of Thankamani incident. And following this, the infamous Suryanalli case, where the abduction and serial rape of a 16-year-old girl from Suryanalli, in which the accused included political bigwigs too. These feminist movements, if we kind of look at them in an overview, the new groups formed from this period rose from the need to address the concrete issues of women's oppression, domestic labor, dowry, different forms of violence, and the sexual exploitation that women faced in Kerala. They were very concrete contexts. Most of these groups were started by activists who belonged broadly to the political left. And they were responding to incidents, they were responding to phenomena that were actually happening around them. What I'm trying to say here is that, again, as in the case of Kalavimarsham or the attempts made there, even while this was a time that second wave feminism was already there in the West and in India, women's studies and second feminist movements or feminist thinking was quite, shall we say, had taken big steps, big strides forward. But much more than a continuation of those theoretical, shall we say, advances made in the rest of the country, the actual springs of feminist movement in Kerala were the real incidents that were happening around them. And these were activists more than theoreticians who were responding to that. But there was another side to it. These activists were also highly critical of the established left's reduction of gender politics into the structures of working class politics. They objected to what was effectively an economistic understanding of women's struggles and insisted on the political autonomy and constitutiveness of such struggles. Along with that, along with this very concrete thing, as it progressed, another aspect that became quite pronounced was a very deep disillusionment with what is the so-called Kerala model, and where a rosy picture of Kerala women is actually drawn in terms of their educational indices, in terms of health indices, in terms of employment indices. But that rosy picture of women in Kerala was radically questioned, and the analysis of the experience of women in Kerala presented a very different story according to these women's movements. And they came up with figures of domestic violence, especially of different forms of violence in the workplace, etc. Within the packaging of the high social status of women in Kerala, according to the Kerala model, it was clearly pointed out that they experience various issues like lack of autonomy, high amount of violence, and lower participation in socio-political economic activities, which altogether created a very paradoxical situation which came to be known as a gender paradox in Kerala, which refers to the contradiction whereby women's high showing in socio-demographic indicators of development existed simultaneously with a low public participation and increasing evidence of violence on them. I'm quoting Mridula, Epen, and Kodoth when I talk about this gender paradox. But coming to this cultural question, it is here that we see the work of an organization like the Kudamalu Stree Patana Kendra. The Kudamalu Stree Patana Kendra Women's Studies Center actually conducted two camps or two workshops. One is the Stree Sahitya camp, the Kerala the women's literature camp, and the other was the Stree Nadaga camp, the women's theater camp. The first was in Kudamalu from 20 to 21 September 1992, and the second, the theater camp, was in Koothatukulam 19 to 25 of December 1992. The notices that they brought out and the deliberations that they had there and the kind of interventions that they planned there and which actually continued. In fact, many of the people who are connected with the Women's Collective in cinema right now one could actually trace a lineage to these particular attempts made in Kudamalur and Koothatukulam. If I may quote from one of the notices, that is actually from the theater camp's notice, it says, "Paramparyathинeyum Achadakkathinteyum പേരിൽ അവതരിക്കപ്പെടുകയും പ്രചരിപ്പിക്കപ്പെടുകയും ചെയ്യുന്ന ഇന്നത്തെ സംസ്കാരം, in inverted commas, culture, സമൂഹത്തെ ജീർണവും പ്രതിലോമകരവുമായ ഒരവസ്ഥയിലേക്കാണ് നയിക്കുന്നത്. ആധിപത്യവും വിധേയത്വവും ഊട്ടി വളർത്തുന്ന ഈ സംസ്കാരം സംഘടിതമായി ആക്രമിക്കുന്നത് സ്ത്രീകളെയാണ്." So in the name of tradition, in the name of discipline, what is being presented as culture within this society is basically a very retrogressive, very decadent kind of system, where at one and the same time, it actually seems to foster, this culture seems to foster, on the one hand, domination, and on the other hand, the ability to submit, or the learning to submit, so to speak. And it addresses, it targets, it focuses upon women. Now, very interesting here that once again, culture is seen as an important domain within which there is structured oppression of women through the values of tradition, accepted mores of society, behavioral patterns, etc. The realization that the manifest cases of violence are only external expressions of a much deeper malaise of violence that is structured into and legitimized by the cultural life of Kerala seems to be an abiding thought which is present in all these attempts. Naturally, it leads to the consciousness that culture is a domain for political intervention, and that such intervention will necessarily have to be in the language or practice of culture and partaking of a rigorous system of critique. It is interesting, in my conversations with Mini, who was actually one of the major, Mini Sukumar, who was one of the major organizers of both these camps, a major text that they referred to continually was Kalavimarsham. It was a very critical kind of engagement that they had with Kala Vimarsham, even as they were, shall we say, drawing upon, I use the word drawing upon, selectively, drawing upon, critically drawing upon the culture of critique that was present in Kala Vimarsham. They were basically quite critical and quite, they objected to the fact that the question of women, of feminist concerns, of female concerns were sidelined in that work. So most fields of culture, especially contemporary ones, such as literature, films, theater, everyday culture, were brought under the lens of these feminist critiques as a result. And if you look at it, just very similar, and I don't want to draw the similarity. It is not a copying. It is a realization on its own level. A realization there is a focus on language as a sphere that facilitates ideas, concepts, and approaches that broadly and subtly foster a patriarchal ideology and a gendered vision of reality. The mooting of the concept and practice of women's writing, Penneditha, which actually happened in the Sahitya camp, in the literary camp, that came up with the literary camp, it started an ideological critique of Malayalam language that led to insistent reconsiderations of age-old expressions and the coming of new ones that are more gender conscious, a process that still continues with unabated vigor. Just think of the way in which Malayalam language has actually transformed, has changed. The number of expressions which has actually gone out have been questioned, and the way in which we've become aware, we bite our own tongues. That is actually the interventions that have been brought on an activist level and a theoretical level by the feminist groups of Kerala, where language, really speaking, has become an arena, a domain for serious political and theoretical intervention. Again, you find the values of an immanent critic, where, as in the case of Kala Vimarsham, in feminist critiques too, culture is not seen as an object, but a process of phenomenon in which the critic is deeply embedded and implicated. There is very little critical distance here. And once again, the primary language is Malayalam, thus entering into the local imaginary and the primary circulation of meanings of the region. And finally, equally importantly, the origins, the sources of this critique is not within academic circles, but from society outside, but from the experiential paradigms of society outside. If you look at the protocols of these particular activities, these movements, you will find that academics was the last thing that they had in mind. Academics was the last, shall we say, province that they had in mind. They were much more given to the idea of a social critique which addressed the reality in those times. Now we come to the third major cultural part of the cultural turn, and which is to do with the emergence of the Dalit movements. The 1990s witnessed the emergence of a number of Dalit discourses in the public sphere of Kerala. In the beginning, they were initiatives by small groups, predominantly in the intellectual domain rather than mass-based movements. Now, this is one departure from the other two examples that I gave, or the other two major parts of the cultural turn. If in the case of the secular left movements, it was primarily part of what one would call the earlier, ML movements, as well as the secular movement. In the feminist, domain, it was a large group of, movements as well as activist circles that made it possible. The beginnings of the Dalit movement was more intellectual and less activist in nature, but it became activist at a later stage. The primary concerns of the Dalit movement, if I may put it that into a nutshell, was the recovery of major historic figures, critiquing the Savarna or high caste structures of Kerala culture, taking a fresh look at the so-called Renaissance or reform projects that defined what we call as modern Kerala, or the modernity projects of Kerala, the struggles for equality in the Christian church, and of course, the rejection of a narrowly economic class-based interpretation of Kerala society. Now, this is again very similar to what happened in the case of feminist activism. This was a point of departure from leftist analysis, which was primarily class-based and where caste was seldom seen as a major structure of limitation. As it developed, it also took the form of mass movements against the alienation of land and raised demands for land rights and so on. Through these interventions, the Dalit intelligentsia succeeded in posing the question of caste as a primary issue of democracy in the state. Caste was seen not merely a shared experience of oppression, but as a history, shared imaginary, and culture of a social group. Caste identity thus came to be seen as one that defined community life, not just in rural circumstances, but in urban circumstances, in public context, in private context, generally within life in general. Now, if you look at it, we find that there are several features which make it quite similar to the feminist movements. Culture is again a constitutive domain in which there is oppression that is structured and naturalized, and a domain that necessitated a radical intervention for political change. There is a focus on language as a sphere that fosters in ever so diverse and subtle ways an upper caste ideology that legitimizes caste oppression and exclusion. Finally, again, the sites of these discourses at first were primarily non-academic, and in Malayalam, even as some of the Dalit intellectuals were indeed academics. Again, they were written primarily in the language of Malayalam. Now, it is in this context, by the late 1990s, 95, 96, 97, it's in the above described scenario, and after the creation, and let me repeat this, a large body of work in Malayalam and some body of work in English too, basically emanating from these political struggles, these political sites, these political contexts that which was discursive, theoretical, and most importantly, within the sphere of political practice. These were all attempts which were ultimately speaking part of a larger paradigm of political practice, which set the scene for what we understand now as the launch of cultural studies in Kerala. This three phenomena, as I told you, I would construe them as a prehistory of cultural studies, or I would say them as a proto-history of cultural studies. And a proto-history which asks serious questions of cultural studies as developed within the academia later on. Serious questions which require us to interrogate cultural studies as it developed later on within the academia in Keralam, as well as elsewhere in addressing Keralam as a site of culture. Looking at that, we realize that it was a network of mutually complementary and mutually critical political programs and movements that contributed to the conceptual and experiential world of cultural studies. And then, if I may, just going very quickly through the entry into the academia, in 1996 in Calicut University, there was a formation of a Forum for Cultural Studies with Dr. T.K. Ramanjandran. I was fortunate enough to be associated with that. And the first seminar was a very political kind of seminar, which actually the title of the topic of the seminar was, the subject of the seminar was, which was attended by Professor Rajan Gurukul among the people here, I think, and in which Professor Gurukul actually presented a paper too. The seminar was on visitations of the past, revivalism and Kerala popular culture. What was interesting about that seminar is, true to the activist backgrounds or the political backgrounds of the formation of Samskarika Vimarshan or cultural studies within the academia before that, the people who were invited for the seminar were not just academics. They were academics, but more than academics, they were people representing different and plural walks of life as participants. We had trade union activists, we had bankers, we had artists, we had newspaper people, media people. The people who made presentations included Sakharia, Professor Rajan Gurukul, K.N. Panikar, P. Govindapilla, Sanal Mohan, K.M. Krishnan, and so on. It was actually not an academic seminar at all. And I still remember with no small measure of pleasure that it was a conference which was heavily objected by the authorities of the university, and where the Pro-Vice Chancellor came to the inauguration and pointedly made a remark that the university had nothing to do with the seminar, and the university authorities do not agree with the politics of that seminar, which actually at the very beginning itself was a note of certification for the value of the seminar itself. Let that be so. In 1997, Sanskrit University started its Center for Cultural Studies with Skaria Sakharia, Sunil Nilayadam, and the others. And then at the same time, there was also work connected with Kerala or addressing Kerala culture in terms of cultural studies paradigm in several other centers like Hyderabad University, JNU, Pondicherry, different places. It actually happened. Now, one major development that happened once cultural studies entered into academia is that even as studies that continued from the earlier described persuasions were there were also fresh entrants into the scene in terms of the politics of identity, which included LGBT studies, as well as what one would call rather uncomfortably as Islamic studies, especially post 9/11, where a number of and the formation and the connections or the kind of alliances wrought between Islamic organizations or the Islamic politics and the politics of the Dalit communities. So these were later entrants into the province of cultural studies. Now, if you look at cultural studies in that sense within the universities, we realize that it is a very broad-based kind of system. Unlike in Western universities, where most often cultural studies have become extensions of the English departments with an old wine in a new bottle, so to speak, where the same old discourse sometimes, unfortunately, I'm not being too fair, but still, the same wine is being put in a new bottle and with the same old discourses appear in a new language and English departments reinvent themselves as cultural studies. Here, such a reinvention has not happened. Here, cultural studies has a much broader base, and the spirit of cultural studies and its approaches seem to have crossed disciplinary boundaries over into a number of disciplines and fields of study, such as Malayalam, history, sociology, philosophy, psychology, even. So there is it is actually like a persuasion, so to speak, rather than a discipline. It is more like an approach, more like, yes, persuasion is probably a better word to use, than a steady fixed set of methodologies or a steady fixed method of studies that are associated with one particular discipline. In that sense, it is plural in all respects. I've reached my conclusion. I'm surprised myself that I was wondering about the time, but let me conclude now. And in conclusion, I don't really have a conclusion. What I have as a conclusion are a few questions which I pose to myself and which I pose to the people here, because these are not questions which I would say that I would insist on answers, but these are questions which I think in terms of the history of cultural studies, where it has developed, originated outside and gathered strength outside in terms of actual political movements, in terms of experiential patterns, and having come into the academia, these questions, and then taken a particular route within academia, these are questions which need to be asked, which need to be posed, at least for clarity for our own sakes. And these are the questions. The first question, after its entry into academia, and after it has become what one would call a discipline, even as it is a trans discipline, even as it is a discipline without disciplinary boundaries, but once it has acquired the contours of an academic system, has cultural studies become a mannerism, a set of methodologies, primarily concerned with theory and not history or with the actual experience of society? And when I say actual experience of society, I know I'm opening myself to all kinds of attacks, that there is no experience that cannot be that is not discursively produced, etc., etc. I know that. But in terms of political understanding of society, has cultural studies become a particular kind of theory-oriented, shall we say, system of study, which seem to be less inclined to look at the actual transformations that are taking place within society today? The second problem is that one also sees certain interesting forms of power and privilege building up within the field, which are quite distant from the original political impulses that inspired work in the field. And it is here that we ask a question. Is there a center marginalized equation developing within cultural studies related to Kerala? Even as one has to acknowledge, and one does acknowledge, that Keralam cannot be understood and limited to a geographical area or a geopolitical area, and perforce has to include the Keralams that are outside its boundaries, as well as the people and studies that emanate from other centers. The question that looms large today is there a privileging of work in English and that which arises from metropolitan centers and universities, and a marginalization of work in Malayalam and that which arises from scholars in Kerala? In other words, I'm sorry to put it in blunt terms, is there another form of Brahmanism at work here? Most importantly, much more than all this, if one were to take into account the original political impulses, I'm not in any way speaking of a kind of activism, but political impulses being the springboard from which cultural critique and cultural studies actually started in Kerala, and which were quite located and specific. Most importantly today, when Kerala society, or the society of Keralam, is more openly communal and supportive of Hindutva, more openly anti-woman. Look at social media. Look at the kind of discourses that we find here. Look at the instances of abuse. More openly casteist and anti-Dalit. What is the response of cultural studies and cultural studies scholars to it? Will we be continuing with our perennial navel gazing, or will we be actually looking at these realities? Especially at a time when the power of the nation, the formation of the nation, or there is a radical redefining taking place within the contours of the nation itself, which subsumes these questions. And this is the most important thing that needs to be probably thought about here. That the question of communalism, of Hindutva, the question of anti-woman or anti-Dalit problems can only be thought in terms of the larger formation of a right-wing Hindu formation, right-wing nation formation, which is very local, which is very specific, but at the same time, which cannot be limited to the local and the specific in terms of the connections with global phenomena of right-wing nation formations. And it is here that I would like to end with T.K. Ramachandran's words. Again, using Malayalam. Anubhava Shagalangal Vismrutiyude Vayil Ninnum Tattiyeduത്ത് ഭാവിയുടെ കരങ്ങളിലേക്ക് ഏൽപ്പിച്ചു കൊടുക്കുമ്പോൾ ആ കരങ്ങളിൽ അത് സുരക്ഷിതമാണോ എന്ന ചോദ്യം സ്വയം ചോദിക്കാനുള്ള ഉത്തരവാദിത്വ ബോധം ഇന്ന് അത്യന്താപേക്ഷിതമാണ്. When we take snippets of experience, elements of experience grasp it from the mouth of forgetfulness, and then give it into the hands of the future, there is a deep responsibility in us to ask if that is safe in the hands to which we are entrusting them. But such a responsibility will be felt and can be felt, I'm afraid, only by those who are located, rooted in the experience of the here and the now, rooted in the experience of reality, and not those who turn age, gender, and community into empty scoring points in academically sterile arguments of political correctness. Thank you very much.